been ongoing for 15 years. This is some seminal work, and if you're interested in a quality, methodical framework to use to implement a particular intervention or practice at your setting, this is a great one to adapt and to consider utilizing. So there are going to be 7 steps that review a global process, and those steps can then be applied to whatever condition or intervention you're interested in. And I would just like to reiterate that much of this work is a culmination of articles and presentations by Darren Padua and Lindsay DiStefano and Ken Cameron, among numerous others. So definitely refer back to the NATA position statement as well as some of their own work for further resources if you're looking to take a bit of a deeper dive into this area. So here are the 7 steps laid out. The first step is to establish administrative support. Next, develop an interdisciplinary team for planning and later for implementation. The third step is to identify logistical barriers or solutions that will either help or hinder the program. After the overall landscape has been discussed, the fourth step is to develop an evidence-based preventative training program. Once the program has been developed, those who will implement the program need to be trained on administration. Finally, measures should be put in place to ensure fidelity or the degree to which the program is being followed. Simply put, this is just a way to ensure that the program that is developed is done correctly. And lastly, an exit strategy. So this is an assurance that the program can be continued in the long term. And we will go into each of these more specifically next. Starting with establishing administrative support. The first step that we will discuss is establishing administrative support. In terms of strategies to gain administrative support, this goes back to understanding the definition of success for this particular sport or setting. In the case of teams most concerned with reducing injury risk, preventative training programs can be presented as a method to increase player durability. By this, I mean that if athletes are not injured, they're more likely to be participating in practice and games, in which case they are continuing to train and improve in sport-specific performance, as well as performing the warm-up program to get a daily dose of a program designed to improve elements of neuromuscular control, agility, strengthening, and other factors. For other scenarios where winning is the primary driver, player durability kind of walks hand in hand with this idea. This is just to say that if your athletes are not injured, they're actually able to play in games, and if you have more of your athletes on the field or court instead of injured on the bench, you're going to be able to put the team's best foot forward to be competitive. And lastly, I just want to discuss this idea of relative advantage. Some coaches or teams are more adverse to change than others. It can be helpful to utilize the existing warm-up, if such exists, as a basis and make minor suggestions or changes to add just a few exercises that hit at different components that may not be a part of the existing warm-up yet. Or to train coaches and athletes to give feedback cues so that they're optimizing the existing warm-up by doing it correctly. Overall, there are a number of ways and strategies to align your justification to meet the needs of your different teams in order to establish this first level of support and buy-in. So after we've established administrative support, the next step will be to develop an interdisciplinary team. So the interdisciplinary team that you put together will be involved in some of the organization, problem solving, and general perspective of the preventative training program development. And this will be variable depending on your setting and personnel resources, which is completely fine. There's no magic combination of professions or number of people. Including stakeholders at different levels improves feasibility and the odds of long-term maintenance. So this might mean that the coaches, as well as the players, the parents, as well as the administration, depending on your setting, you may also have strength and conditioning personnel on your sports med team who can be huge allies in developing and maintaining the program. Additionally, you're likely going to have some skeptics on the team. It's really important to get buy-in from these individuals because, in my experience, once you can get the most vocal anti-voice on your side, those people can become your strongest supporters and allies down the line. Again, there's no one size fits all, and your team will likely vary in size depending on the scope of your setting and number of athletes, whether it's an individual team of 20 athletes or an entire military platoon. So for the next step, the interdisciplinary team should identify logistical barriers and, very important, solutions to those barriers. So barriers and solutions can span a huge variety, but here we have them divided into 4 subcategories, starting with the top left corner. So time, or how long the program is and how frequently the program will be implemented within a given week or a given season. Personnel, who do you have on your team that's available to help with implementation, monitor fidelity, who's there to answer any questions? For the environment, where are you working? Are there constraints on the location or the equipment available? We'll talk about this point later on, but these programs are designed in such a way that equipment is not necessary, but there's enough freedom and creativity where you can use certain items to enhance the sport-specific components of the preventative training program. And lastly, the organization. This refers back to the definition of success and the goals of the team or the program. What are the current behaviors, and how do we enhance that? So first, time. Again, this is not only how long a single preventative training program session will last, but also how frequently the warm-up will be performed within a given week or a season. I mentioned some of the background evidence earlier, but program effectiveness is related to program dosage, where athletes who perform preventative training programs correctly more frequently have an additive benefit where they are more likely to see the program benefits and are able to retain those benefits for longer. One common scenario that comes up is that coaches will want shorter, or in some way different, warm-up programs for game days compared to practice days. This is a great opportunity to use your interdisciplinary team to develop 2 different programs where you may have more time to include additional core strength and balance exercises on practice days to prepare for participation, but maybe your team needs to shorten the warm-up down to the integral agility and sport-specific exercises for game scenarios. In that scenario, your athletes are still able to engage in some level of preventative training with a focus on neuromuscular control on every day of activity, but there may be some freedom to accommodate to the nature of the sport and reality of your context. Next, personnel. Depending on the sport and setting, the interdisciplinary team may have different members. This might include the head or assistant coach, a team captain, or the players themselves, depending on age and ability to independently run the program successfully, or perhaps a team athletic trainer or strength and conditioning coach. What's important to consider here is not just who will implement the program, but who will be there initially to train and later support the implementation efforts of the program. For instance, if the team had decided that it is most feasible that the players run the program themselves, who's in charge of training the athletes how to do the program, and who will check in to see if there are any new questions or concerns after the program has been implemented a few times. An example of this is some work that's been conducted with youth AAU female basketball players. An entire organization decided that they wanted to implement team-specific preventative training programs for each team within their overall organization. Each team wanted the head coach, assistant coach, and players to be trained on how to implement their own team program. Clinical athletic trainers from a nearby university attended the first practice, and the researcher implemented the program while the coaches observed. The AT then returned for the next few practices, where the coach gradually took over control of the warm-up program. The ATs were present to offer tips or suggestions for ways to give feedback to athletes or how to increase the efficiency of the warm-up. The coach could then gradually pass the responsibility onto the athletes themselves. From there, the AT would return once every few weeks to check back in and to see if they wanted to progress exercises or if there were any new questions. While this implementation scheme may not be realistic for every scenario, this is simply an example that there are ways to utilize resources and to train others to support the effort. To now turn to another logistical consideration, your setting will dictate space constraints and the need for equipment. In terms of space constraints, here's a picture of a preventative training program being implemented at West Point with first-year cadets. In this scenario, there was a specific field area where all first-year cadets needed to perform the warm-up in unison. To address this barrier, program organizers suggested that cadets stand in place to perform the exercises. In that case, the jogging portion of the traditional format is eliminated, but the exercises are still performed. In other cases, there may be sport-specific considerations. Here we have a basketball tournament, which brings up two separate points. In one case, there are often space constraints where physical space is limited or the warm-up can't be performed on the court or field prior to play. In such cases, it may be beneficial to get creative with warming up in the hallways, outdoors, etc. A second important point loops in the idea of equipment needs. Coaches and athletes may want sport-specific components of their warm-up. To address those needs in a basketball population, we incorporate exercises where the athletes can dribble the basketball whenever possible. For example, a cutting exercise, such as pictured here, is common to basketball. Sliding defensive drills are also quite common. In those types of exercises, an athlete could also dribble a ball to dual task the sport-specific skill of dribbling along with the actual exercise goals. However, in general, equipment is not needed, and exercises that address the main components of a preventative training program, such as strength or agility, can be completed without any conditioning equipment. There's also this idea of the organization's culture and general perceptions of preventative training programs. The first concept I'd like to discuss is that of relative advantage. This is simply how much more advantageous is a preventative training program compared to whatever program the team currently uses. How would a preventative training program differ from that current program in terms of length or exercises or in how it's implemented? Coaches have different beliefs, strategies, and training plans, so sometimes a preventative training program isn't too different, and implementing it is simply a matter of emphasizing feedback cues and adding in an exercise here or there. In other times, a preventative training program could be a huge overhaul. So in any case, to promote buy-in, you really have to convince the organization that using a preventative training program will be more effective than the existing warm-up, and also knowing what that change and what that shift would look like for your team. A common coach complaint that I've fielded is this idea that preventative training programs make athletes more fatigued prior to athlete participation. It's more advantageous to start a new habit of a preventative training program at the beginning of the season. So in those times, there's a lot of novel exercises at play that could lead to the perception that the athlete is fatigued prior to activity. Additionally, the exercises often prescribed for preventative training programs have a certain degree of finesse involved because you're trying to focus on movement quality so that the athletes are utilizing muscles that they may not have previously used. However, all that being said, you'll remember the study we discussed earlier where the preventative training program was as effective as a dynamic warm-up, and both the preventative training program and the dynamic warm-up were more effective than the static warm-up to prepare athletes for physical participation. So oftentimes this is just a conversation to have with the coach and the athletes in your organization to explain that while it may seem challenging initially, the exercises will become more familiar and easier with time. Additionally, there's the idea of screening for injury risk and then customizing a preventative training program for specific athletes in order to zero in on weaknesses or areas of improvement. This is a great way to promote buy-in for individuals. However, general programming may be more advantageous for a team setting because the program can be completed as a group and the athletes can motivate one another and hold each other accountable. So depending on your particular condition, intervention, and setting, you'll need to find what works best for your circumstances. So to sum it up, there's this need to identify what programs work for whom, when, and under what circumstances. I don't know that there's a magic answer for this, and many of the implementation considerations really boil down to how well do you know your population's needs, how well do you understand their personalities and culture, and how can you best meld the two areas to optimize the prevention strategy. So that takes us through some really global barriers and ways to find solutions. Another way to identify setting-specific barriers is to conduct a pre-mortem analysis, which we will discuss next. So does anyone listen to the Freakonomics podcast? If you don't, you should. It's fantastic. At any rate, on one of their podcasts, they discussed this idea of a pre-mortem analysis. You may be more familiar with a post-mortem analysis, during which a coroner will determine the cause of death. In a pre-mortem analysis, you are predicting the cause of death of your idea. So this is a silent brainwriting activity. To conduct the analysis, you would ideally have your implementation team present around a table, and each person would have their own sheet of paper. You would then provide the group with the writing prompt. Imagine that the program has failed. So you want to put it in everyone's heads that the idea has already failed, and now you want to know why. Each person would then take 5 to 10 minutes to silently write down a list of all the reasons why the idea has failed. When they feel exhausted of ideas, they may grab another person's list and try adding to their own list, either by writing things like agree or adding onto ideas that the other person had. After a set amount of time, you would collect everyone's list and develop a comprehensive list of all of the barriers, and then as a group, you would work through solutions. This has been done in VA hospitals to ensure implementation success with different standards that they were implementing. And although it might take a little bit to get a group of coaches or a team together to do this activity, it could be really worthwhile to really set the stage for this is what we're going to do and how do we best do it so that nobody feels like it's too burdensome for them. This would be an example of something you might see during the pre-mortem analysis. Perhaps everyone agreed that the overwhelming barrier to the intervention was time. From there, the group works to create a number of solutions. The first solution listed here addresses the idea that a single session is too long. So keeping the program to 10 to 12 minutes is an acceptable range for coaches and eliminates that barrier. The second solution listed addresses the idea that new ideas can take time to get used to a particular format or habit. Therefore, if a team were to implement the entire prescribed warm-up on the first day of practice, the warm-up could last closer to 20 to 25 minutes. Remember, form and feedback are keys to the implementation. So to address this other spin on the time barrier, we might decide that the team will only do as many exercises as possible in that 10 to 12 minute window, and as the team gets more efficient and comfortable with the habit, they will gradually add exercises until the entire program takes less than 12 minutes. The third solution listed addresses time as a function of format. Sometimes, particularly for coaches learning how to monitor form and provide feedback, they can only watch a few athletes at a time. However, if each athlete were performing the exercises one at a time, the warm-up might take longer. To address this time constraint, the athletes could stand in a few lines so that only 3 to 4 athletes are doing an exercise at a given time, or if the coach gains confidence, the entire team could perform the exercises at one time. Overall, there are a number of ways to interpret the barrier of time, so it's important to provide solutions that are comprehensive and can capture any number of situations based on the specific setting. The name of the game is understanding the context of your implementation setting.